I never thought a trash can could start a war, but the moment I moved into this quiet, perfectly manicured neighborhood, I realized that appearances could be deceiving and peace could be fragile. And on my very first Thursday night, when I rolled my bin to the curb, I had no idea it would mark the beginning of a battle I hadn't signed up for. A battle with a neighbor I would come to know only as Karen, the type of woman who smiled sweetly at strangers but seemed to take private pleasure in policing everyone else's life. A woman whose house was always immaculate, her lawn flawless, her hedge lines perfectly straight. The kind of neighbor who could smile in a friendly way while delivering the sharpest, most passive-aggressive critiques of your every move. And I was just trying to settle in, to make my little house feel like home after months of moving chaos and the stress of unpacking boxes that seemed never-ending, when I discovered that my trash can had been knocked over the very next morning, bags torn open, food scraps scattered across the driveway, cardboard flattened and wet from dew, and I felt my stomach tighten, thinking maybe it had been the wind or a careless passerby. But the pattern repeated week after week, every Friday morning like clockwork, until the truth became undeniable, that someone was watching me, tracking my habits, and deliberately turning a small act of inconvenience into a personal message. And the message was clear, even if unspoken. This is my street and I am watching, and I will correct anyone who does not follow the rules as I interpret them. And the rules in question were small, trivial things that hardly mattered, things like where I placed my trash, how I maintained my lawn, the angle of my mailbox. But the enforcement was relentless, constant, and humiliating, a way to assert control that made my blood boil, because I had never encountered anyone who could take so much pleasure in policing another adult over something so minor yet somehow feel righteous in doing it. And I started to notice other signs, small but infuriating, like notes tucked into my mailbox about weeds, polite but pointed reminders about HOA regulations, and the occasional glare when our paths crossed in the street, a glare that made me feel judged and exposed, as if every move I made was being recorded and evaluated against some invisible standard I had no choice but to meet. And I tried at first to reason with myself, to dismiss it, to tell myself it wasn't personal, that maybe the neighborhood had strong rules and someone just cared too much. But the day I caught her standing across the street, hands on her hips, glaring at me while my trash can lay toppled like a victim at my driveway, I knew it was personal, and I also knew I could not let it continue, because it was not just about the mess or the garbage, it was about respect. It was about my right to live without being micromanaged, and it was about standing up to someone who thought her small slice of power entitled her to control every inch of the street. And I could see the satisfaction in her expression, the smug little smile that suggested she had won some invisible battle, and I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief, wondering how someone could spend so much energy on something so meaningless. Yet the truth was, this was the first real test of my patience, the first indication that living here would not be as simple or peaceful as the glossy brochures had promised. And as I stared at her, trying to mask my irritation with a forced smile, I realized that the conflict was no longer just about a trash can. It was about the kind of person I was willing to be, about whether I would let someone else dictate my life in small, nagging increments, and that realization made my heart race, my mind spin with strategies, and my frustration build into a determination I hadn't expected. Because I am not the kind of person who backs down when challenged, no matter how trivial the challenge may seem to others. And so I began to observe her subtly at first, noticing the time she walked her dog, the way she glanced at houses along the street, the exact moments she appeared at her window to make sure everyone was following the rules as she saw them. And I began to piece together a pattern, a schedule, a rhythm that I could use to my advantage if I chose to, and the thought of turning the tables, of asserting my own boundaries without confrontation, filled me with a quiet thrill, a sense of empowerment that contrasted sharply with the indignity of having my trash repeatedly sabotaged. And at the same time, a flicker of unease remained, because I knew I was entering a kind of chess game I had never anticipated, one where every move mattered, where miscalculations could lead to more petty attacks or escalations. But I also knew I could not continue to endure these small humiliations week after week without some kind of response, because the tension was growing, a knot in my chest that tightened every time I saw the mess waiting for me in the morning, every time I felt her judgmental gaze from across the street, every time I held the crumpled HOA note that lectured me on some minor violation. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to myself that I would not be the passive participant in this game, that I would reclaim control of my property, my routine, and my peace of mind, and I started to imagine solutions, clever and discreet ways to stop the destruction, ways that would not cause a scene but would send a message, ways that would protect my trash while also giving me a sense of quiet satisfaction, a way to turn the power dynamic on its head without ever having to confront her directly. And as I stood there in the fading light of the evening, staring at the empty street and the still-standing trash can that had been toppled only hours before, I felt a mix of anticipation, nervousness, and determination, knowing that the next steps I took would define the kind of neighborhood life I would have, and that this small but persistent conflict had awakened a part of me that I had never really tested before. A part that was clever, strategic, and quietly relentless, and that part of me was ready to act, ready to assert boundaries, and ready to make sure that HOA Karen, for all her control and smug satisfaction, would never again think she could intimidate me with something as small as a trash can, because I had learned the first rule of dealing with people like her. Patience, observation, and planning were more powerful than anger or confrontation, and I was already beginning to put that rule into practice, one careful step at a time, even as I felt the storm of emotions, frustration, amusement, anticipation, and determination, building inside me, preparing me for the showdown that was quietly brewing in the quiet, deceptively calm neighborhood where nothing was ever truly peaceful and every small act could become the start of something much larger than it appeared. The following week, the pattern continued with an almost maddening precision, as if Karen had a secret calendar marking exactly when she could ruin my morning before I even stepped outside, and I began noticing the little things that hinted at her obsession, like the way her eyes seemed to follow me when I took out the trash, the subtle twitch of her lips when she saw me struggling with a heavy bag, the way she would glance down her street with a calculating expression as if making mental notes of everyone's behavior, and each time I walked past her perfectly trimmed hedge or the spotless sidewalk in front of her house, I could feel her presence like an invisible hand pressing against my chest, reminding me that she considered herself the authority here, that she believed her sense of order trumped anyone else's right to peace. And at first I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was harmless, that maybe I was overreacting. But the deeper I looked, the more obvious it became that this was deliberate, that it was personal, and the sense of being watched, of having my life scrutinized over. Something as mundane as a trash can began to gnaw at me, leaving me restless at night, replaying each encounter in my mind, wondering what she might do next, how far she would take this silent war, and whether she would escalate to other parts of my property or my personal life, because once control becomes a habit, it rarely stops at one small victory, and the thought of her standing there, smirking as if she had won some invisible battle, filled me with a mix of fury and determination. Heat in my chest that pushed me to start documenting everything, taking notes about what was happening and when, photographing the mess left behind, noticing patterns in her routine, like the time she walked her little dog precisely at 7:05 a.m., always glancing at my driveway as if timing me, and I began to map out a mental plan, one that required patience and precision, because I knew reacting impulsively would only give her more satisfaction and could escalate the situation. And yet the desire to respond, to finally reclaim control of my own space, grew stronger with each day, a pulse that I could not ignore, so I started researching ways to protect my trash in clever and non-confrontational ways, reading articles and watching videos about secure bins, motion sensors, and devices that could deter tampering, and as I learned more, I felt a thrill of empowerment, imagining a future where I could finally take back the small corner of my life she had been trying to dominate. And, in the meantime, the tension in the neighborhood thickened like fog, because I could sense whispers and sideways glances from neighbors who had noticed her intensity. People who had stories of small but persistent disputes over lawns, mailboxes, and parking spots, and it became clear that Karen's need to control extended beyond me, that she had cultivated a reputation that made most neighbors too nervous to speak up. But I refused to let that fear influence me, and so I watched and waited, learning the rhythm of her surveillance, noticing when she was most likely to be outside, how she timed her walks, how she lingered at windows, how she seemed to derive satisfaction from the slightest disruption, and I began to anticipate her moves, creating a mental chessboard where every action she took could be countered with precision. And the more I observed, the more I realized that this wasn't about garbage or HOA rules at all. It was about ego, control, and power, and the longer I lived with the daily invasion, the more I understood that I needed to outthink her rather than confront her directly, because that was the only way to win without creating a spectacle. And as I plotted my response, I started to notice other subtle provocations, little signs that she enjoyed testing me, leaving her garden hose stretched across my driveway once, or positioning her trash cans in ways that made it harder for me to maneuver mine. Small acts that were almost playful if they weren't so. Frustrating, and each one of them fed the rising tension inside me. A mixture of irritation and exhilaration that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't expected, because I had underestimated the impact of someone who seemed so trivial but had such a strong presence, and I realized that the stakes were not just about bins or mess. They were about my dignity, my right to live without constant scrutiny, and the satisfaction of standing my ground, and that realization made me more focused, more deliberate in my actions, and more determined to plan something clever. Something that would demonstrate that I was not an easy target, because the quiet, simmering war was now a test of character, patience, and ingenuity, and every day that passed without resolution only fueled the intensity. As I imagined the moment when my strategy would come to fruition, when I would finally have the satisfaction of knowing that her control was no longer absolute, that I could exist in my own home without her interference, and yet the uncertainty of timing, the fear of miscalculating her moves, and the knowledge that she was unpredictable kept me on edge, making each day feel like a high-stakes game of anticipation and restraint. And as I watched her pacing across the street one morning, her dog tugging at the leash, her eyes scanning the neighborhood like a general inspecting troops, I felt a mixture of fear, respect, and excitement, because she was formidable in her way. But I had learned that even the most controlling people had blind spots, and if I could exploit them with patience and precision, I could not only stop her interference but do so in a way that she would never see coming, and the thought of that possibility made me pulse with energy. A quiet thrill that mingled with the simmering anger that had been building since the first time I saw my trash scattered across the driveway, and I knew that I was standing at the edge of something. A turning point where observation, planning, and patience could change the dynamic entirely, transforming a daily frustration into an opportunity for clever, satisfying action. And even though the tension in the neighborhood remained high, and even though I knew she was watching, judging, and perhaps planning her next move, I felt a growing sense of confidence, because I had discovered something important about myself. That I could respond with intelligence, calm, and strategy, rather than rage, and that understanding gave me a kind of power that Karen had never anticipated. And as I prepared for the coming days, as I plotted the exact steps I would take to protect my property and reclaim my peace, I felt the first stirrings of excitement, the kind that comes when you know you are about to turn the tables on someone who has underestimated you, and the realization settled in that the quiet neighborhood, with its pristine lawns and white picket fences, was about to become the stage for a silent but satisfying confrontation, one that would test patience, creativity, and nerve, and I was ready to meet that test head-on, because the rising tension was no longer just something to endure. It had become the fuel for the cleverest, most satisfying response I could imagine, and for the first time, I felt a sense of control, of anticipation, and of quiet exhilaration that the next chapter of this conflict was entirely in my hands. The morning came faster than I expected, and when I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the silence, the kind of quiet that makes your skin tingle because you know something is about to happen. And sure enough, there she was, Karen, perched near the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, eyes sharp and assessing, her dog sitting obediently at her feet. And the moment our eyes met, I felt that familiar surge of irritation, mixed with a pulse of determination, because I knew she had been watching me even before I opened the door, that every movement, every glance I had made over the last few days had been catalogued in her mind as evidence of defiance or incompetence. And it became clear in that instant that this confrontation was no longer about trash cans or HOA rules. It was about pride, about control, about the subtle, invisible war she had declared against me. And as I carried my bin to the curb, I noticed the little trap she had laid for me. A subtle nudge of her own trash can positioned at a slight angle, as if daring me to make a mistake, and for a split second, I considered reacting impulsively. But I caught myself, inhaled deeply, and reminded myself that patience was the weapon I had chosen, that this was no longer a simple annoyance but a chess game where every move mattered. And as I adjusted my can, the hair on the back of my neck stood up because I could see the faint smirk playing across her lips, the kind of smirk that implied satisfaction at someone else's struggle, and in that moment, something inside me shifted, a mix of frustration, anger, and a spark of strategic excitement because I realized that if she thought she could intimidate me with subtle provocations, she had no idea what was coming. And as I wheeled the trash can into position, I began to notice other changes in her behavior, small but telling, like the way she lingered at her gate longer than necessary, watching me with a calculating intensity, or the way she seemed to time her dog's movements to coincide with mine, creating a sense that every step I took was orchestrated to provoke or unsettle me, and the tension inside me tightened like a coiled spring, because I had underestimated just how personal this had become, and it dawned on me that I was no longer dealing with a casual neighbor but a woman who seemed to define her identity through control over others, and that realization made my blood boil, even as I felt a rush of adrenaline at the thought of outsmarting her. Because now it was no longer just about protection or peace of mind, it was about asserting my own presence, demonstrating that I would not bend, that I would not become a passive participant in her silent games, and as the day wore on, the mental strain increased, because every glance from her window, every casual comment about keeping up with rules, every pointed sigh when I trimmed my bushes or adjusted my mailbox felt like a direct attack, a reminder that she believed she had the authority to dictate not just the physical space but the emotional climate of the entire street. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was exactly the kind of challenge I had been craving without knowing it, the kind of conflict that tested patience, creativity, and nerve all at once, and I started imagining scenarios, clever responses, subtle maneuvers that would allow me to reclaim control without creating an overt confrontation, because I knew that overt resistance would only escalate her obsession and give her the thrill she craved. And as I plotted, I noticed yet another twist in her behavior, the way she began to adjust her schedule in response to my patterns, walking her dog earlier, lingering longer by the street lamp, giving the faintest nod to neighbors as if to signal that she was aware of everything, and I realized that she was adapting, that she was learning my routine just as I had learned hers, and that knowledge made the stakes feel higher, more personal, because this wasn't just a simple tit-for-tat anymore. It was a battle of wits, an invisible struggle where mistakes could cost pride, peace, and the quiet satisfaction of victory, and I began to notice other subtle signs, like the way the neighborhood seemed to respond to her presence, how her confidence seemed to ripple through the block, making others hesitant, cautious, as if her approval or disapproval mattered more than any rule, and that realization fueled my determination to act with strategy and precision, because I knew that if I could execute a plan that combined cleverness and subtlety, I could not only protect my property but disrupt the illusion of control she had cultivated so meticulously. And as the afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across the street, I watched her move with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession, positioning trash cans, adjusting garden ornaments, and giving faint, sharp looks at neighbors as if to mark her territory in invisible ink. And each action reminded me that this woman was not just a neighbor. She was a force, and facing her would require more than irritation or casual resistance. It would require ingenuity, patience, and a complete understanding of the psychological games at play. And as I prepared mentally, I noticed another layer of tension emerge, a quiet escalation in the way she interacted with others, subtle jabs in conversation, sharp comments that carried an edge of judgment, and it dawned on me that her control extended beyond my driveway, that she had constructed a network of influence, subtle but effective, that kept people on edge, that made minor acts of independence feel risky, and I understood that confronting her directly might not only fail but make me a target of even greater scrutiny, so I shifted my strategy entirely toward observation, subtlety, and planning, watching for patterns, noting weaknesses, imagining how even a small, clever intervention could create disruption without confrontation. And that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying, because I could feel the tension building not just inside me but in the air. The street charged with the unspoken battle between control and resistance, and as evening approached, I caught sight of her from my window, lingering by the corner, hands on hips, her posture rigid, a silent sentinel waiting to see if I would falter, and in that moment, I understood that this conflict had become a test of character, of endurance, and of cunning, and I felt a shiver of anticipation, knowing that the next move I made would set the tone for everything to come. and that every observation I had made over the past days could be used to my advantage if I was careful, deliberate, and patient, because victory would not come from anger or confrontation. It would come from strategy, subtlety, and timing, and, as I prepared for the next day, mapping out every possible scenario in my mind, I realized that the invisible war was no longer about a trash can. It was about proving to myself that I could maintain control, protect my space, and outmaneuver someone who thought herself untouchable. And the thought of finally turning the tables filled me with a mixture of fear, excitement, and determination that made my pulse race, because the conflict had become personal, psychological, and utterly consuming. And I knew that the next steps I took would define not only the outcome of this battle but my own sense of agency. And that realization made me sharper, more focused, and ready to act with precision when the moment finally arrived. The next morning started like any other, the sky a pale gray, the street quiet except for the distant hum of a lawn mower and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But the moment I stepped outside, I sensed that something had shifted, that the air carried a tension, thicker than usual, and my eyes immediately found Karen, standing near the corner of her driveway, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable, the dog at her feet unusually still. And I realized before I even approached that this day would not unfold like the others, because something in the way she held herself, the sharpness in her gaze, suggested that she had escalated her game, that whatever had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks was about to boil over. And as I wheeled my trash can to the curb, I noticed that it had been tampered with in a way I had not anticipated, a faint scratch along the side, a small dent that made me pause and run my fingers over it. A subtle but unmistakable signal that she had been physically manipulating my property in a more invasive way than before, and the surge of anger that hit me was immediate and intense, my heart pounding as I realized that she was no longer just challenging my patience. She was crossing a line, asserting dominance in a way that felt personal, deliberate, and unervingly bold. And as I studied her from a distance, I saw her lift a hand and make a gesture toward me, subtle but loaded with meaning, as if she was daring me to react, to falter, to acknowledge her control. And in that instant, the stakes shifted entirely, because it was no longer about small annoyances or clever observations. It was about proving to myself and to her that I would not be intimidated, that I had the ability to stand my ground even when provoked in ways that felt invasive and humiliating. And I felt a surge of determination unlike anything I had experienced before, a combination of fear, adrenaline, and exhilaration that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts sharpen into razor focus. And in that moment, I understood that this was the turning point, the moment where patience alone would not suffice, where strategy would have to merge with action, and where the outcome would define the entire dynamic of our relationship. From that day forward, and I started to plan in real time, observing the subtle movements she made, noting the angles from which she could see me, the distances she kept from her own property line, and the timing of her gestures, cataloging every detail in my mind like a general preparing for battle, because I realized that even one misstep could lead to escalation or humiliation, and I could not allow that to happen, not now, not after weeks of subtle provocations that had tested my patience and resolve. And as I continued to watch, I noticed something I had not expected, a crack in her composure, a faint hesitation in the way she adjusted her stance, a momentary glance away that suggested she had miscalculated something, and that small opening felt like a beacon, a signal that I could act, that I could take the first step toward reclaiming control in a way that would shift the balance entirely. And the realization sent a thrill through me, because I had been preparing for this, waiting for that exact moment when observation, patience, and strategy could intersect to create a decisive advantage. And I felt the familiar surge of cleverness and resolve, knowing that the next actions I took could both protect my property and make a statement without a single word being spoken. And yet, even as I formulated my plan, I could feel the emotional weight pressing down, the mixture of fear, excitement, and righteous indignation that had been building for weeks reaching a crescendo, because I knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would be remembered, would define the boundaries of our unspoken war, and I could not allow hesitation to undermine the careful planning I had invested so much thought into. And as I moved the trash can slightly, aligning it with the angle I had chosen, I realized that this simple object, so mundane to anyone else, had become the centerpiece of an emotional and psychological showdown, a symbol of respect, boundaries, and personal agency, and the knowledge that she was watching, that every flicker of movement would be scrutinized and interpreted, added a pulse of tension that made my senses sharper, my mind clearer, my focus absolute, and I began to feel the subtle thrill of anticipation, knowing that I was on the verge of something significant, a moment where cleverness and timing could transform weeks of frustration into a quiet but undeniable victory. And then it happened, the unexpected twist that made my heart leap, as a neighbor I barely knew emerged from the house across the street, stepping onto the sidewalk with casual curiosity, interrupting the careful rhythm of our unspoken duel, and Karen's expression flickered, a shadow of uncertainty passing over her face as she adjusted. And in that split second, I realized that the dynamic was shifting, that outside eyes had the power to alter the psychological landscape, and I seized the opportunity, moving the trash can in a precise motion I had practiced in my mind countless times, watching for her reaction, anticipating the subtle twitch of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, and when she reached toward the can, it resisted in a way she could not have expected, snapping back upright. A small but satisfying demonstration of control and cleverness that made her step back, her composure faltering for the first time, and the sight of her hesitation sent a wave of triumph and relief through me, because I realized that the weeks of observation, planning, and mental preparation had converged in this precise moment, creating a turning point where I could assert my presence without confrontation, and the emotional impact hit me all at once, a mix of vindication, empowerment, and cautious exhilaration, because I knew that this was only the beginning, that the stakes had risen, and that the conflict would continue to escalate, but now with a new layer of tension, a new awareness of limits and capabilities, and I could feel the weight of anticipation pressing forward, because I understood that Karen would not take this quietly, that she would analyze, recalibrate, and respond, and that knowledge made the next steps even more critical, more thrilling, and more nerve-wracking, because I was no longer merely defending my property or asserting minor rights. I was participating in a psychological duel where patience, cleverness, and timing were everything, and as I stood there, feeling the subtle adrenaline and satisfaction of small but decisive action, I realized that the turning point had arrived, that the landscape had changed, and that the weeks of tension, observation, and planning had culminated in a moment that would shape the next chapter of this quiet but fiercely personal war. And I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion, exhilaration, and readiness, knowing that from this moment forward, the stakes were higher, the tension sharper, and the potential for dramatic, satisfying resolution within reach, as I watched Karen regroup, her expression a mixture of surprise, irritation, and grudging acknowledgement, and I knew with certainty that the game had changed, that I had found my advantage, and that the next moves I made would carry the weight of this turning point into the climactic confrontation that I had been building toward, the moment when patience, observation, and strategy would finally pay off in a way that would leave a lasting impression on both of us. The morning I had been waiting for arrived with a mix of nervous excitement and tense anticipation that made my chest tighten and my hands slightly tremble, and as I stepped outside, I felt the weight of the weeks of observation, planning, and mental preparation pressing down on me, knowing that everything hinged on the next few moments, and sure enough, Karen appeared almost immediately, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp and calculating, her dog obediently at her side, and I could feel her confidence radiating across the street as she approached my trash can with that familiar air of control, expecting the usual chaos, expecting me to react with frustration or hesitation. But this time, nothing would go as she anticipated, and as she reached for the can, the moment I had orchestrated unfolded perfectly, the bin snapping back upright with a subtle but unmistakable force that caught her completely off guard, and I watched her startle, her body jerking slightly, her smirk faltering into confusion as she tapped it again, harder this time, only to be met with the same unyielding response, the can moving as if guided by some unseen hand, and I felt a surge of triumph and adrenaline as I stepped out onto the curb casually, waving as if nothing had happened, even as my pulse raced and my mind hummed with the precise calculations that had brought me to this moment, and Karen's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief passing across her face as she realized that her usual tactics were failing, that the control she had wielded so effortlessly for weeks was slipping through her fingers, and in that instant, the tension between us reached a peak so intense I could feel it vibrating in the air, a silent but charged confrontation that needed no words, and I could see her searching for some explanation, some reason, any rationalization to justify why her careful monitoring and constant interference were suddenly powerless against something as simple yet perfectly executed as a trash can. And as she stepped back, flustered, her composure cracking, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile of satisfaction, not cruelly, but with the deep, satisfying knowledge that patience, observation, and planning had triumphed over intimidation and ego, and as she stood frozen, processing the moment, I felt a mixture of relief, exhilaration, and a kind of quiet empowerment that I had never experienced before, because I had claimed control without confrontation, without escalating her aggression, proving silently but unmistakably that I would not be intimidated, that I could protect my space, and that cleverness and strategy could outmatch the loudest displays of authority. And yet, even as the adrenaline coursed through me, I noticed the immediate fallout, the subtle shifts in the neighborhood, the way a few neighbors emerged cautiously from their homes, glancing at the scene with curiosity and surprise, whispering quietly to one another as if witnessing a private but significant victory. And I realized that Karen, for all her composure and meticulous planning, would have to rethink her approach entirely, that the illusion of effortless control she had cultivated was shattered in a single, precise moment, and I could see the frustration building in her body language, the way her shoulders stiffened, the hands that had once been so confidently placed on her hips now trembling ever so slightly as she adjusted her stance, the tight line of her lips betraying the internal calculation of what to do next, and I felt a strange mixture of empathy and triumph, recognizing the human vulnerability beneath the controlling exterior, while simultaneously reveling in the quiet justice of the situation, because after weeks of harassment and subtle intimidation, I had finally shifted the power dynamic in a way that was both effective and completely safe, and as I leaned against my porch railing, watching her fumble with her own trash can as if seeking a solution to an invisible problem, I realized how satisfying it was to reclaim authority without drama, to assert boundaries without confrontation, and to do so in a way that would leave a lasting impression. And yet the emotional intensity did not end there, because Karen, in a rare, unguarded moment, let out a sharp sigh, a mix of irritation, disbelief, and grudging acknowledgement, and I sensed the internal storm raging within her. The way she was recalculating every detail, analyzing what she had misjudged, and I felt a mixture of anticipation and suspense, knowing that this confrontation had changed everything, that it had altered the invisible rules of our little battlefield, and that the coming days would be different, quieter perhaps, but charged with the knowledge that I had proven myself capable, clever, and unflinching. And as I carried the empty bins back toward my garage, I could hear the faint shuffle of her feet retreating, the low murmur of a muttered comment, and I understood that though the immediate battle was won, the psychological ripples would linger, reshaping not only her perception of me but the subtle social dynamics of the street. And in that quiet aftermath, I felt the weight of weeks of tension finally lift slightly, replaced by a deep, quiet satisfaction, because the battle had been waged and won on my terms, and the emotional stakes, though high, had been met with patience, intelligence, and resolve. And as I closed the garage door and leaned against it, letting out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding, I felt the full impact of the climax wash over me, the adrenaline fading into a profound sense of accomplishment. And even though I knew Karen would eventually reassess, adjust, and perhaps attempt to regain some semblance of control, I also knew that the dynamic had fundamentally shifted, that my quiet but decisive victory had altered the course of our unspoken war, and that knowledge brought a mixture of relief, pride, and cautious optimism, because I had discovered something essential about myself, about patience, strategy, and the subtle power of clever, non-confrontational action, and I understood that the fallout, while immediate and tangible in Karen's stunned reactions, would continue to ripple through the neighborhood in small, telling ways, as whispers, glances, and the knowledge of what had occurred would quietly reshape the invisible balance of power. And even as I carried the emotional weight of triumph, satisfaction, and lingering tension, I realized that the climax had not only resolved the immediate conflict, it had also set the stage for everything that would come next, creating a turning point in which I could assert boundaries, reclaim peace, and navigate the rest of my days with a newfound confidence that no petty provocation or controlling neighbor could undermine. And as I finally stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I let myself smile, fully, knowing that, for the first time in weeks, I had taken control, that the tension that had shadowed every morning had been confronted and overcome, and that the emotional intensity of this moment, the climax of patience, planning, and courage, would remain with me. A reminder that careful observation, strategic thinking, and quiet determination can transform frustration into triumph and fear into empowerment, and that the consequences of clever action can be both immediate and lasting, shaping not only the present but the future in ways that are satisfying, dramatic, and entirely within one's control. The days that followed the climax felt different in ways that were subtle but profound, as if the air on our street had shifted, carrying a quiet acknowledgement of the battle that had taken place and the invisible line that had been drawn, and I could see the change in Karen almost immediately, in the way her shoulders no longer held that rigid posture of authority, in the fleeting hesitation before she spoke when addressing neighbors, in the careful neutrality she now maintained as if she had learned, finally, that her control was not absolute, and with that shift came a strange sense of relief and curiosity, because I realized that the tension that had shadowed every morning, that had made simple acts like taking out the trash into exercises in endurance and patience, was slowly easing, replaced by a more measured awareness on both sides. And in that quiet adjustment, I noticed something else emerging, a subtle humanizing of the woman I had previously thought of only as an antagonist. As I glimpsed her briefly at her window, a small, unguarded smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the hint of someone reflecting on her own actions and perhaps reassessing the energy she had invested in controlling others, and it struck me that the conflict, though frustrating and personal, had opened a window into understanding her. That beneath the perfectionism and control there was a person shaped by fear of disorder, by the compulsion to assert order in a world that often felt unpredictable. And while that realization did not erase the weeks of irritation and anxiety she had caused me, it added a layer of empathy that softened the edges of my triumph, because I understood that her need to dominate was born from insecurities that were as human as my own desire for peace and autonomy. And with that perspective, I found myself feeling a strange combination of vindication, satisfaction, and compassion. A mixture that made the mornings feel lighter, the air easier to breathe, and the street itself less like a battlefield and more like a community where boundaries had been tested, asserted, and respected. And as I went about my routine, carrying the trash can out with calm assurance, adjusting my mailbox, tending my small garden, I could feel the subtle shifts in energy around me. Neighbors walking with more ease, small conversations carrying genuine warmth rather than cautious deference. And I realized that the silent assertion of my presence, my strategy, and my patience had not only protected my space but reshaped the social balance on the street in a way that was quiet, clever, and deeply satisfying. And in those moments, I reflected on the personal growth I had experienced, the patience I had cultivated, the ability to observe, plan, and execute without letting anger or frustration dictate my actions, because it was in that measured, strategic response that I had discovered my own strength, resilience, and capacity for subtle yet decisive action. And the emotional impact of that realization was profound, because I could feel a deeper sense of confidence and empowerment settling into my daily life. A quiet assertion that went beyond the trash can or Karen's interference and touched the way I navigated challenges, relationships, and boundaries in general. And even as I walked past her house on the street one afternoon, exchanging a polite nod that carried no tension, I sensed the mutual recognition of the unspoken truth, that the dynamic had been permanently altered, that respect for boundaries had been established without hostility, and that the weeks of tension had transformed into a more balanced coexistence that felt secure, stable, and honest. And as I returned to my own porch, setting down a cup of coffee and taking in the view of the neighborhood bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, I reflected on the lessons embedded in the experience, on the power of observation, patience, and thoughtful action, and on the emotional intelligence required to navigate human conflict without losing composure or integrity. And I thought about how this small, seemingly trivial conflict over trash and rules had become a crucible for personal growth, sharpening my awareness, resilience, and strategic thinking. And in that quiet moment, I could almost hear the echoes of past frustrations fading, replaced by a sense of accomplishment that was both private and enduring, a satisfaction that did not rely on her acknowledgement but was rooted in the knowledge that I had acted with clarity, control, and purpose. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. I felt a profound sense of closure and peace, knowing that the invisible war had reached a natural conclusion, that my boundaries had been respected, that my home could now be my sanctuary without daily tests of patience, and that the emotional journey, from irritation to strategic triumph to reflection and understanding, had left me stronger, calmer, and more confident in my ability to face subtle conflicts with intelligence and poise. And even though Karen remained part of the neighborhood, still meticulous and precise in her routines, the edge of tension had softened into mutual awareness, a quiet balance where neither of us needed to overstep, and that realization filled me with a deep, lingering sense of satisfaction, a cinematic and emotional closure that allowed me to feel the full arc of the conflict, the growth, and the resolution. And as I sipped my coffee and looked around at the tidy but lived-in yards, the neighbors chatting across driveways, the quiet rhythm of suburban life unfolding in measured, unhurried ways, I understood that what had begun as a petty, frustrating struggle over trash had become a profound lesson in patience, strategy, empathy, and personal empowerment, leaving me not only victorious in a practical sense but transformed in a way that felt cinematic, dramatic, and deeply human. A reminder that the quiet battles in life, when met with intelligence, resilience, and calm assertiveness, can lead to satisfaction far greater than the initial conflict, and that peace, once claimed thoughtfully and courageously, carries its own emotional reward that lingers long after the struggle has ended. And in that moment, on my porch, surrounded by the soft hum of the neighborhood and the golden warmth of the setting sun, I felt a sense of completion, of growth, of balance, and of quiet triumph, knowing that I had emerged not only victorious but wiser, stronger, and fully aware of the subtle power that comes from patience, observation, and thoughtful action, and that understanding would stay with me long after the trash cans were aligned and the street returned to its serene rhythm, leaving a lasting sense of empowerment, satisfaction, and cinematic closure that made every moment of tension and frustration worth enduring. Weeks passed after the turning point, and life on the street settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and quietly transformed. The tension that had shadowed every morning replaced by a calm awareness that boundaries were understood and respected. And I found myself noticing subtle changes not just in Karen but in myself. The way I moved through my days with a newfound sense of confidence and calm. The way I could take out the trash, water my plants, or step onto my porch without the undercurrent of anxiety that had once made even small actions feel like careful maneuvers in a silent war. And in observing Karen from a distance, I began to sense a shift in her demeanor as well. The meticulous rigidity softened into something more measured, less sharp, as if the weeks of confrontation had forced her to recognize not just my determination but the limits of control itself. And that recognition brought a strange mixture of satisfaction and empathy, because I understood that beneath the perfectionism and the need to dominate, she was navigating her own insecurities and desires for order. And I realized that the conflict had not only been about trash cans or HOA rules but about understanding human behavior, resilience, and the quiet power of thoughtful, patient action. And as I walked down the street in the golden light of late afternoon, greeting neighbors with genuine warmth rather than cautious politeness, I noticed the subtle shifts in the community as well. The way people moved with less hesitation, the way small conversations carried more openness, a reflection of the invisible tension that had lifted, replaced by a recognition that the neighborhood could function without rigid, controlling oversight. And in those moments, I reflected deeply on the lessons I had learned, on the patience required to observe, understand, and anticipate the behavior of someone who seeks control, on the discipline needed to resist reacting impulsively, and on the power of strategy, timing, and subtlety to reclaim not just property but dignity, personal agency, and peace of mind. And I realized that these lessons extended far beyond the conflict with Karen, touching the way I approached relationships, work, and challenges, teaching me that confrontation is not always necessary to establish boundaries, that cleverness and patience can achieve far more than force or anger, and that understanding the motives, fears, and patterns of others can transform frustration into opportunity, insight, and quiet empowerment. And as I returned home one evening, the sky painted with shades of amber and rose, I felt a profound sense of completion, the culmination of weeks of tension, observation, and strategic action crystallized into a new awareness of my own capabilities and resilience, and I understood that the victory was not measured simply in the stability of a trash can but in the mastery of patience, the assertion of boundaries without hostility, and the emotional growth that came from navigating a subtle but intense psychological conflict. And I reflected on the broader implications on how often in life we encounter people who try to impose control, who provoke with small but persistent acts, and on how easy it is to be swept into reactionary cycles that leave us drained, frustrated, or diminished. And I realized that the true power lies in observation, understanding, and deliberate, measured response, in choosing the moment and method of action so that the outcome asserts dignity and agency without unnecessary escalation. And as I sipped my tea on the porch, watching the evening settle softly over the neighborhood, I thought about how this experience had strengthened my awareness of human nature, of subtle social dynamics, and of the way personal power can be exercised thoughtfully rather than aggressively. And I felt a deep sense of pride in having maintained composure under pressure, having turned irritation into strategy, and having transformed a frustrating, personal conflict into an opportunity for growth, reflection, and emotional mastery. And I considered how Karen's own behavior, tempered by the lessons of our confrontation, might shift, and I felt a quiet empathy for her, recognizing that the drive for control often masks insecurities, fear, and the desire for validation, and that understanding this did not excuse past behavior but offered insight that made the experience richer, more meaningful, and ultimately transformative. And I realized that the street itself had changed, not dramatically, but subtly, a microcosm of human interaction where patience, respect, and thoughtful action created a balance that had been absent. And in that reflection I found a lasting sense of closure, not just in the practical sense of peace reclaimed, but in the emotional sense of having navigated conflict with intelligence, calm, and dignity. And I understood that this story, though small in scale, carried lessons applicable to many areas of life, lessons about observation, strategy, patience, empathy, and the assertion of boundaries. And as I looked at my neatly aligned trash cans, my garden in order, and the quiet street bathed in twilight, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a cinematic, emotional completion that acknowledged the tension, the conflict, the triumph, and the growth. And I realized that the greatest satisfaction came not from defeating someone else, but from discovering my own strength, patience, and capacity for measured action. And in that realization, I found the lasting impact of the experience, a reminder that even in small, seemingly mundane conflicts, there is the potential for growth, insight, and quiet empowerment, and that the patience to observe, the courage to act strategically, and the wisdom to reflect deeply transform not just the outcome but the person navigating the challenge. And as night settled softly over the neighborhood, with lights glowing warmly in windows and the quiet hum of life continuing peacefully, I felt a serene sense of completion, a sense that the chapters of tension, confrontation, and resolution had led to something enduring, meaningful, and deeply human, leaving me with a final understanding that control, patience, empathy, and thoughtful action are the tools that allow us to navigate conflict, assert ourselves, and emerge stronger, wiser, and fully aware of our own power and resilience. And I smiled quietly to myself, knowing that life would continue with its challenges. But I had discovered a profound truth about how to face them, and that knowledge, subtle, cinematic, and deeply satisfying, would stay with me long after the trash cans were aligned. The streets, quiet, and the tension faded, leaving a lasting sense of empowerment, balance, and reflective peace that would shape my approach to every challenge yet to come.